Hi, my name's Pastor Sophia Peart. I'm from the Hanworth Community Church in London. It is so great to be with you once again, All Nations Church. We've worshipped together so many times before, and now we're worshipping together this one more time under unprecedented circumstances. But nevertheless, I'm really glad to be with you. I'm sending greetings to you from the Hanworth Community Church. Your pastor was with us just a few weeks ago, and we heard a powerful sermon from him. Today, I'm going to be preaching to you about Judah and Tamar, and the whole theme is about doing the right thing to put things right. So I pray that you're blessed. I pray that this will transform your lives, and I pray that you'll be able to take something away that will enhance your life for the future. God bless. Have you ever noticed that there are times that doing the right thing just feels so hard? It can be as simple as not wanting to tell your friend that they have a piece of spinach stuck in their teeth, to as hard as deciding that it's time to let staff go because the company is about to go into bankruptcy. The fact is, every day we go through this up and down of doing the right thing. When it's a small thing, it's really not hard, and we can continue with our day. But when it's hard, we can find ourselves searching for a way out of having to do it. Let alone it becomes harder when we're being mistreated or when things are not going right for ourselves, and we still have to make the decision to do the right thing. God tells us that He will be with us every day and every step of the way. And that means that He'll be with us when we have to make really tough decisions and do things that are really hard. God has promised that He will supply us the strength to get through it. However, today we'll be answering this question. We'll be asking, under what circumstances does God require us to do the right thing? Does He require us to do the right thing even when we're being mistreated? Now, for us to answer this question, I would like you to join me as we explore a text of scripture that we've often stayed away from because it's not really considered to be PC for the platform on a Sabbath morning. It's a story that we've tended to kind of glaze over. It's a challenging text. And it's a text that we struggle sometimes to find some practical, redeeming applications for us. Yet today, I would like us to rise to this challenge to find some gems. It's the story of Tamar and Judah. This story finds itself in the middle of the epic story of Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob. And I've always wondered why the writer here diverts from Joseph's story to this one. Why not continue with the story of Joseph and then come back to Judah and his family? Now, before I go any further, let me ask those of you who know the story, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of Tamar? Cold-blooded, vindictive, manipulative, immoral? How about Judah? What comes to your mind when you think of him? The son of Leah, the fourth son of Jacob, the lion of the tribe of Judah. The contrast between the two are remarkable, don't you think? Judah is seen as someone who makes a few unfavorable decisions in his life, whereas Tamar is seen as a much more problematic character. Nevertheless, I would like to suggest to you today that this woman is not as problematic as we would think. There is more to Tamar than meets the eye. In fact, she's not your run-of-the-mill character, and her acts are not as immoral as they may seem. I believe her story calls us to question how we are to respond when we're seen by our family, friends, society, and dare I say, the church as a problem. Her story provides some practical applications for how we can navigate through constantly being mistreated. She shows us how, in the middle of unfair treatment, we can still do the right thing to rectify the wrong and bring forth blessings for you and those who have wronged you and even wider society. Throughout her story, we will see how God can use us to be agents of justice in the spaces that we occupy. This is what we'll look at, that God can call us to do the right thing even in the most unfavorable circumstances, to put things right. So here we have it. The story of Judah and Tamar begins in Genesis 38. It follows the sale of Joseph into slavery. Now, we all know the story of Joseph, the younger brother of Judah. So Judah now decides to leave home and start a family with a Canaanite woman. Now, what's significant about this marriage is that up until this point, the males of the family, particularly the males who would carry on the family name, were specifically required not to marry Canaanite women. They were off limits. Nevertheless, this is what Judah does, and together they have 3 sons, Er, Anan, and Selah. Once the eldest, Er, was of age, his father arranges for him to be married to Tamar. Now, we don't know exactly, but we can presume that Tamar was of Canaanite descent. But here's where we arrive at our first issue. However well this merger may have turned out for the heads of both families, because for them in those times, marriages were like business transactions. For Tamar, this marriage was a complete disaster. Now, I know you're probably thinking lots of couples struggle in their first few years of marriage. The first few years are the testing years where couples are getting into their groove and learning to live with each other. But Tamar's marriage was a nightmare by anyone's standard. Any girlhood hopes she may have had for her life were quickly shattered by her husband, Er. Scripture tells us her new husband was wicked in the sight of the Lord, but spares us the gruesome details of his wicked acts. But consider this, no one spared Tamar. She lived with Er's wicked behaviour every day. A dull and unhappy marriage is one thing, but a marriage to a wicked man is a completely different ballgame. No one knows what Tamar suffered, and only Tamar can tell her truth. So even though the text doesn't explicitly state what Er was doing, whatever he was doing, when God saw it, he considered it bad enough to take his life. So the Bible tells us that the Lord kills him, just like that. It takes the life of Er, and I believe in taking the life of Er, God was protecting Tamar. You see, God is in the business of protecting those who are vulnerable, those who can't fight for themselves. That's a part of who God is. He's the God of mercy, a God of compassion. He's a God who's ready to protect and to deliver. And here we see a prime example of his mercy, his protection, and his deliverance of Tamar. With her first husband dead, Tamar was now a widow with another major issue. She was childless. Er had been killed by God without even producing an offspring that would continue his name and inherit his estate. Additionally, in the absence of Er, a child, particularly a male child, would have provided some security and support as Tamar grew older. But Er is out of the picture before he has a child with Tamar. Not to worry. There is an emergency plan in place, and it's an ancient custom to save a childless dead man from extinction. And we can find this emergency plan in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 to 10. Now, according to this ancient custom, if a man died without a child, his brother would marry and impregnate his widow. The son born from this union inherited the name and the estate of the deceased. In other words, Judah's second son, Anan, was to marry Tamar so that the child they would conceive would inherit the estate of Er. Sounds simple. Well, not so simple, as this solution was complicated. It obligated both the widow and the living brother to make costly sacrifices for the man who died. The brother next in line was positioned to enjoy financial prospects and the heightened privileges of the eldest son. However, this custom made him duty-bound to place his life on hold until he fulfilled his obligations to his dead brother. And his widow could not just move on and start a new life. She too was honor bound to preserve her husband's name. This emergency solution required extraordinary sacrifice that we may not fully appreciate. So Tamar could follow this plan, right? Well, any relief Tamar felt at the death of her first husband is short-lived, as she goes from one crisis to another. In a brief span of time, her second marriage turned out to be just as bad as her first. Anan pretended to do the honorable thing by marrying Tamar and having sexual relations with her. But each time they were together, he spilt his semen on the ground to keep her from producing an offspring. Apparently, he repeatedly degraded her by using her for his pleasure, then denying her the opportunity to conceive. And we can only imagine how appalling and humiliating his actions were for Tamar, even more since she had entered this second marriage for the sake of honor and family loyalty. His actions demonstrated a reluctance to do the right thing for his deceased brother and his family. Now, according to Deuteronomy 25, if the living brother who refused to fulfill his duty would fall under deep disgrace, and this is what Anan did, he made the decision not to impregnate his brother's wife and instead left her childless. So let's read together in Deuteronomy 25, 7-10. It says, "But if the man does not want to take the brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate to the elders and say, 'My husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother.' Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. But if he stands firm and says, 'I do not want to take her,' then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his feet, spit in his face, and answer and say, 'So shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house, and his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had the sandal removed.'" Now, you may be thinking, there's a policy in place that can help Tamar. Here, this emergency plan has a safeguard for this widow who's refused a child. Yes, you're right. And as we all know, there's a difference, though, between having a policy in place and affecting that policy or acting on the policy. Tamar was actually powerless to do anything about Anan's cover-up. Why? Because of her social position. She was a widow with no children and therefore no voice within her family or society. In addition, Tamar was broken after possibly being abused in her first marriage, grieving the loss of her first husband, and is now being mistreated by her second husband. She may not have necessarily have had the physical, emotional strength to action the policy. She needed an advocate to stand with her, and there was none to be found. She seems to be powerless to do anything about what's happening to her. And the sad reality is that there may be family and friends who know what she's going through, but have decided to remain silent. I recently read a blog from the Gottman Institute titled "Neutrality is Invalidation." It basically said, those who've studied trauma have learned that when witnesses to injustice do nothing, it's a greater source of distress for sufferers than the act of brutality itself. This is because neutrality is a form of deep invalidation. When we humans experience invalidation from others, it sends a message to the survival parts of our brain that we aren't valued or protected. And this lack of safety creates pressure under which the human mind eventually will either implode or explode, usually a little of both. I would like to go on to say that this is one of the key reasons why people do not report incidences of abuse, mistreatment, and injustice, because they've experienced neutrality, which have led to invalidation and therefore a lack of safety and trust in those around them. This thing is happening today in our homes, in our workplaces, in our churches, in our communities in which we live. In this story of Tamar, Anan was in a position where he could have done the right thing. Instead, he chooses not to. Others around were in the position where they could do the right thing, and they choose not to. God will place us in positions of power to do the right thing, even in the most unfavorable circumstances, to put things right. The positioning may be right for you. The title may fit you well, and the benefits you receive from being in the position may be the best in town. But remember, God has placed you in the position to do the right thing for those around us and for His glory. Doing the right thing may mean that we lose a few friends along the way. Doing the right thing may mean that we may face criticism. Doing the right thing may mean that we're not invited to the next social gathering, distance gathering. Doing the right thing may not feel comfortable to us. The circumstances may not feel right to us. The circumstances may not always benefit us directly. The circumstances may cause us to be perceived in a certain way. Today, more than ever, we have found ourselves at a point in the world's history where there is so much going on. Yet, we as God's people are called to share the gospel and the good news in the most practical way, which is by doing the right thing in the lives of those around us. This is how we put things right. When we see others who are treated unfairly, we have a responsibility to do the right thing for them and by them to put things right. What do you do when you see someone who has been treated unfairly? Do you rise to their aid? Do you help their voice to be heard? Do you see them? Or do you relinquish your responsibility? Sit back and say it's nothing to do with me. Do you look at them and question, why did they find themselves there in the first place? Do you stand on the sidelines watching to see how they will find their way out themselves? Back to the story, Anan gets away with being brought before the elders of the town and held accountable for his actions. But he doesn't get away with it with God. Be aware. God will hold us accountable to do the right thing. And this is especially applies when we are in positions where we can do right. God will not allow blatant injustice to go on without dealing with it. And that's why we can trust God. I want us to see and grasp this concept today. We can trust that God sees when things are not right. Trust God knows what He requires someone to do, and when they do not do it, He knows that too. Sometimes it can feel like God can't see the injustice taking place around us, but God specializes in putting things right, and that is exactly what He is doing right here in the text. God steps in. Ironically, Anan loses his life trying to save it. God kills Anan. We may consider this to be a harsh action of God to kill the two sons of Judah, but what it reveals is that God takes abuse very seriously. His eyes are not blinded to those who are going through the evil of abuse in whatever form it manifests itself, whether physical, emotional, financial, sexual, or neglect. God sees and He hears the cries of those who are being abused. He not only hears their cries, but He will act on their behalf. Psalms 34 tells us, when the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. I don't know what your living situation is like today. Maybe it's your work, or maybe it's within your marriage. I want you to know today that God sees and God hears your cries, and God has the power to deliver you today. Judah's now grieving the loss of his two sons, and he's down to one living son. Fearful that marriage to Tamar would cost his third son, Selah, Judah stalls by sending his daughter-in-law back to his father's house to live as a widow until his youngest son was grown. The perceived problem in this situation is the solution to the real and larger problem in this narrative. Tamar is the perceived problem. Tamar, the one who has two abusive marriages, widowed twice, honor bound to have a child, and is perceived now to be the problem. There's no conversation about what's happened. Judah doesn't try to seek understanding of what's taken place within the two marriages. Rather, he suspects she's the problem. She's the reason why her first husband is dead. She's the reason why they do not have an offspring. She's the reason why her second husband is dead. And I can imagine within their community, it's not just Judah who suspects she's a problem. Maybe other family members have the opinions, and maybe friends have their thoughts, and she's known around the wider community as the woman whose husbands never seem to remain alive. I can imagine her being labelled as the wife of death, a label that sticks with her. I remember growing up as a child, dreaming of working at the two large hospitals in Sheffield. Little did I know that one of these hospitals was known within our black community as the graveyard. I remember hearing elders from our church talk about which hospital they would prefer to be admitted to, if it ever became necessary, and they would share that they don't want to be admitted to a certain hospital because it was the graveyard. And they would jokingly say, prepare to come out in a box if you go into that hospital. This was because they'd known of countless members of their community who were admitted there and never came home again. They just did not want that to be their fate. So if they could avoid it, they would clearly state their preferences. So just like this hospital had gained a reputation, so too had Tamar gained a reputation about her fitness as a wife. She had a reputation of killing off her husbands. But here, Tamar has actually been treated unfairly. She's been used. She is now broken. She's been humiliated. She's alone. She's feeling rejected. And she now has to live with the reputation of being the wife of death. And with that reputation, her father sends her away. This is not the first time Judah sends someone away as he sees them as a problem. Remember the previous chapter with his younger brother Joseph? He was the one who suggested to his brothers that Joseph be sent away. And just like that, Joseph is out of their lives. I wonder how many times we do this to people in our very own families, friendship groups, workplaces, or even church. We do not fully take the time to understand their circumstances. We do not take the time to understand why they are behaving a certain way or doing a certain thing. We do not want to ask the question, what's going on? Instead, we want to silence them, draw our own conclusions about the person and their situation, and then brand them as a problem. And in doing this, we fail to deal with the real problems that exist. In fact, we would prefer to remain blind to the real problem and swim comfortably with these issues rather than dealing with them to put things right. So what do we do instead? We send the problem away. We send the problem away because in sending the problem away, we do not have to deal with it. We do not have to see it. We do not have to be responsible for it. We do not have to own it. We can turn our backs on it. We can wash our hands and we can simply get back to normal as if the problem never existed. Someone watching has heard that they are a problem. They're the reason why things haven't turned out the way that they have. That trouble follows them wherever they go, and that's why they are the problem. I want you to know that you are not a problem. When God sees you, he doesn't see a problem. When God hears your cries for help, he doesn't want to silence you. For you are precious in his sight, and he takes delight in you. You're not a problem. Rather, you are the special agent in the solution to a problem. Why do I say that? Because what Judah doesn't realize is that in the real problem at hand is how his family line will continue. How will an offspring be produced from his sons? How will he have a grandson who will carry on his name? I was speaking recently with a friend of mine who has 2 girls. He and his wife are done now with having children, and he'd come to the realization that his name, as unique as it is, would discontinue as if he didn't, and as he didn't have any sons who would carry on his name. Now, even though his girls could choose to double barrel their name, it was no guarantee that his surname would continue. Now, don't get him wrong. He loved his girls, But there was a little sadness in his heart that this would actually occur in his future. And this was the real problem that Judah was blind to. He needed an offspring. God had already pronounced the promise over his forefathers, and now the responsibility was on him to fulfill this promise. Yes, he has one more son, Selah, but the fear of Selah dying prevented him from doing the right thing, which was allowing him to marry Tamar and bear an offspring. His problem wasn't Tamar at all. His problem was that he was blinded by the fear to the solution to his real problem. This demonstrates to us that fear can paralyze us from doing the right thing. Fear can paralyze us from taking the necessary steps we need to take to put things right. Fear can cause us to close our eyes and ignore the real problem, or better still, not want to address or explore the real problem. And this is what Tamar discovers when she's sent away by Judah to her father-in-law. She's not the problem, but rather she's the solution to the real problem in this family, and he just can't see it. So he sends Tamar away and tells her that he will send for her when his only living son, Selah, is of age. So the Bible records Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. Now, many would perceive Tamar being returned to her father's house as shameful or disgraceful. But I would like to suggest to you that this was the initial steps in motion for the process of grace to occur in this family. Tamar was about to get herself together, get clarity, get confidence, and gain perspective. In her father's house, she would be reminded of her purpose in life. I believe in sending Tamar back to her father's house, she returned to a place of healing for her mind, her body, and her soul. She returned to a place that was home, a home she could be seen through her loving eyes of her father again. She returned to a place that knew her. She returned to her father's house to shake off the reputation that she had gained. She returned to her father's house to experience the love of her father again. She returned to her father's house to rebuild her identity. She returned to her father's house to be refreshed, for her task on earth was not yet complete. There's something about going to our Father's house, and I'm not talking just about our earthly Father, but rather our Heavenly Father. When we're broken, when we've been abused, treated unfairly, when we're seen as a problem, marginalized, oppressed, when we feel dejected, when we're rejected and pushed aside, just know we can go to our Father's house. In our Father's house, there is fullness of joy. In our Father's house, there is safety, peace, and protection. In our Father's house, He will anoint our heads with oil. In my Father's house, there's no weapon formed against us that will ever prosper. And in Tamar's father's house, the insightful words later spoken by Joseph in Genesis chapter 50 were echoed here. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Sending Tamar to her father's house was the best thing that could have happened to her and Judah's family line. The time she had spent in her father's house only confirmed to Tamar her duty, but Judah was blocking her path. She waited there in her father's house. A long time passed. Selah, Judah's youngest son, grew to manhood, but Judah showed no signs of keeping his promise. At this point, she couldn't afford her husband's name to be cut off because she had no legal recourse left. No one in Judah's household remembered Tamar, and Tamar was still in an impossible predicament. But once she'd spent time in her father's house, she became convinced of Judah's intention, or lack of intention. A marked change then came over her. You see, up until this point, she'd accepted a passive role in this story. She was always the object of the action. Judah got her for heir, gave her to Anan, sent her home to wait for Selah. But when she heard that Judah had just recovered from being widowed himself and was on his way to shearing his sheep, Tamar saw a window of opportunity that she would seize. Now, The verbs belong to her. And in a flurry of deliberate action, Tamar takes off her widow clothes along with her passive inaction. She dresses up as a prostitute, covers her face to conceal her identity, and then she places herself in a path that she knows Judah would cross. She was focused, she was courageous, and she had a plan that was about to be activated with grace and hopefulness. So the Bible records that when Judah notices her, he obviously thinks she was a prostitute since she'd covered her face. So he stops and he propositions her, not realizing that she was his own daughter-in-law. She asks, "How much will you pay to be with me?" And he promises to send her a young goat from his flock. She then holds him to account for this young goat by asking him, "What will you give me to guarantee that you will send the goat?" Now, unsure of what he could offer that would be of any value in that moment, Judah replies, "What kind of guarantee do you want?" She answers, "Leave me your identification seal, its cord, and the walking stick you're carrying." So Judah gave them to her, and then they went together and she became pregnant. Afterwards, she went back home, changed back into her widow clothes, and basically, after all that was said or done, Tamar had left the scene with the equivalent of Judah's ID, his credit card and his driver's license. Now, even without the aid of a DNA test, Tamar can prove the identity of the father of her unborn child. Tamar knew Judah well enough to know that her plan would succeed. It's important to note at this point that this ancient custom supported the marriage of the father-in-law to his son's widow in order to produce a child to carry on the deceased son's name and inheritance if no brother was available to fulfill his duty. In other words, Judah and Tamar getting together to conceive a child in these circumstances was permissible under this ancient custom, and would have been the only way out of what seemed to be a gridlock situation. However, one would think that Tamar was bringing Judah down by causing him to be with a prostitute. But I'd like to suggest to you today that she wasn't bringing him down. He was already down. He saw the prostitute. He approached her, and the bargaining process began. He skipped the small talk and got straight to the point. "Come, now, let me sleep with you." Tamar negotiated like a woman, first exacting the payment, then letting him set the price. Clearly, Judah was acting on impulse, for he didn't have the goat he promised in payment for her services. She demanded a pledge, and this time shrewdly set the terms herself, his seal and the staff in hand. So the story continues. Later, Judah asks his friend to take the young goat to the woman to pick up the things that he had given her as a guarantee. But this man couldn't find her. He asked the other men, "Where can I find this prostitute who was sitting here by the road?" They respond, "We've never had a prostitute here." So the friend returns back to Judah and tells him, "I couldn't find her anywhere." And the men of the village claim that they've never had a prostitute here. So Judah's response is just let her keep the things that I've given her. I've sent the young goat as we agreed, but you couldn't find her, and we'd be a laughingstock in the village if we went back to look for her again. The story continues that about 3 months later, Judah's told that Tamar, his daughter-in-law, has acted like a prostitute and is now, because of this, has become pregnant. Hear Judah's response. "Bring her out and let her be burnt." Notice Judah's vigor against Tamar. When he heard she was a prostitute and pregnant, she was, in the eye of the law, seller's wife, and therefore being with child with another man was looked upon as an injury and a reproach to Judah's family. But how quick are we to cast the first stone when Jesus isn't looking at us? In this indignant outburst, Judah condemns Tamar and sentences her to die for a crime he knew he had in his own past. Tamar's timing, though, is perfect and was one of the most dramatic moments in biblical history, not simply because of the shocking revelation, but for something she never could have anticipated: her father-in-law's reaction. The story continues, but as they were taking her out to kill her, she sent this message to her father-in-law: "The man who owns these things has made me pregnant. Look closely. Whose seal and cord and walking stick are these?" Judah recognizes them immediately and says, "She is more righteous than I am because I didn't arrange for her to marry my son Selah." And Judah, the Bible says, never slept with Tamar again. It was a watershed moment for Judah. His confrontation gives him the opportunity to take full responsibility for the way that he treated his daughter-in-law and the whole family. And Judah does just that. He takes responsibility openly. In fact, the precise translation in the Hebrew shows that Judah takes full blame by acquitting her and also praising her. He says, "She's the righteous one, not me. She's the one who's in the right." He knew that in that moment, something deeper had driven Tamar to such radical measures, and he saw it right away and called it righteous. In other words, she did the right thing. I have so much respect for Judah in this moment, not because it's easy to be wrong and strong, but rather it's hard to be wrong and strong and then have to take a huge U-turn. It takes courage, it takes guts to openly confess that I've messed up. And that's what we see him doing here. Judah takes responsibility, and in doing that, he admits that he's treated her unfairly and clears her name by putting things right. Judah is never the same again after this incident. He made things right between him, his daughter-in-law, and his community. The reality is, even when we've been mistreated unfairly, God still calls us to put things right. And there are three requirements that we see in this story. The first is to focus on doing the right thing. Rather than focusing on the injustice, unfair treatment, we can focus on God, who has called us to put things right. The second thing and the second requirement that we see is courage to step out and do the right thing to put things right. This may mean going against the status quo. This may mean looking a little bit silly to just put things right. And the third is to carry the burden that God has placed on our hearts with grace and hope that things will get better. It's reassuring to know, especially with so much wrong in the world today, that there is a God in heaven who cares about justice and truth and who always does what is right. He sets the standard for what is right. And when his people bear his image, they do what is right too. Tamar goes on to give birth to two sons of Judah, Perez and Zereth. Her son, Perez, becomes the great-grandfather of David, and his disciples lead all the way to Christ. Someone who was mistreated unfairly still chose to do the right thing to put things right, and from their lineage, one man is born years later, and that man is Jesus. Jesus, God's only son, was given to us, the world, and paid the price for all the wrong we had done by doing the right thing, which was to lay down his life as a sacrifice to put things right for you and for me. And in putting things right, we can enjoy the pleasure of knowing God today and embracing the hope of living eternally with him when he comes. When we accept that Jesus has become our Savior, by doing the right thing, we too become his agents in the world to do the right thing. Every one of us have been strategically positioned by God to do the right thing and put things right. So you may be in positions of leadership in your workplace or in church. You may be at home and thinking that you don't have any power. You have the power to put things right. Maybe you need to put things right by having a conversation. Maybe it's a paper you need to sign. Maybe it's something that you need to do that would take time and a lot of effort. But I want to encourage you today to make those first steps towards doing the right thing to put things right.